So before I begin my formal remarks, I'd like to take a moment to pay tribute to a person that many of you knew well, and that's the late Phil Klass, skeptic in chief, right? I know that each year NCAS presents the Philip J. Klass Award for outstanding contributions in critical thinking and understanding, and I applaud and salute you for this. I want to tell you about how Phil and I met. I was returning from an assignment at Misawa Air Base in northern Japan. I was a captain at the time, and this was mid-1967, summer of 67. And Phil was the senior avionics editor for Aviation Week, which really was the New York Times of the trades. They were the standard, and still are for that matter. Well, Phil and I had a friendly but adversarial relationship over programs that he was covering, aircraft in development, like the FX, which became the F-15. Hello. The lightweight fighter, that became the F-16, and the AX, which became the A-10. Now, these were programs that among my responsibilities as an Air Force Pentagon spokesman. So UFOs wasn't my only account. However, Phil and I, as I said, we had an adversarial, friendly but adversarial relationship on those programs, but we bonded over so-called flying saucers. When in the late 60s, I was the Air Force UFO spokesman, and Phil was the great debunker. It was Air Force policy not to engage in debates over the origin of flying saucers, whether that was a good policy or a bad policy. It was the policy. So when requests came in for radio or TV talk shows, I would politely decline, but refer the callers to Phil, who never met an interview request that he didn't like. When I retired from the Air Force in, it was the end of, we had a ceremony at the Pentagon at the end of September 1988, believe it or not, time flies. Phil attended that ceremony, and he presented me with this plaque. UFOs are real, the Air Force doesn't exist. Now, he inscribed it on the back for me. To Colonel Dave Shea, I was a colonel at that time, who, as a lowly captain assigned to the most crucial post in the Pentagon, managed to keep the nation's greatest secret, crashed saucers and alien bodies, under wraps, and arranged for the Air Force to pay me $1 million a year to debunk UFOs. Philip J. Klass, September 28th, 1988. A treasure. I keep that in my man cave. One more story before I move on to the full portion of my remarks. My first assignment in the Air Force was at Andrews Air Force Base, right from college. I went to Andrews August 3rd, 1959. Who can forget your first day of active duty, right? So that was, it was a directed duty assignment, which means because I was a communications major, I did not get formal training in military public affairs at that time. But in 1961, the summer of 61, the Air Force sent me on temporary duty to what was then called the Army Information School, which at the time was at David's Island in New Rochelle, New York, outside of New York, you know. Now today all the services send their public affairs, their newly minted public affairs people to Fort Meade, the Defense Information School, not too far from here. In any event, a speech class was part of the presentation. And each student was to give a presentation, an informal informational presentation on the subject of his or her choice. For some unfathomable reason, I chose the Air Force, what the Air Force knows about flying saucers. And I remember, part of the speech thing was to have an attention step, right? Get their attention. So as get their attention step, that morning, I borrowed a saucer from the cafeteria. And I walked up the aisle, and as I turned, I flipped that saucer down the aisle, I don't think it broke, but anyway, I did get an A on that presentation. Little did I know that some 6 years later, I would be inextricably bound with UFOs. Okay, January 8th, 1969, that was a red letter day for the Air Force. Why? Well, that was the day we took possession of the University of Colorado's scientific study of unidentified flying objects. The Condon Report, as it was popularly known, was a result of 18 months of intensive scientific inquiry into a phenomenon that was to plague the Air Force for more than 20 years, UFOs or flying saucers. So there I was at the Pentagon South parking lot, those are familiar with the Pentagon, with a hand truck. And my job was to load 40 cartons of the report, containing 225 copies of the report. Now, the report was delivered to me by Dan Taylor, a guy named Dan Taylor, who was the information officer at the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, which was the contracting agency for the Condon study. So Dan delivered the report. As I signed for that report, he said to me, "They're all here, and they're all your brother. They're all yours, brothers." And I said, "Thanks, Dan, I think." So there I go. I headed straight for Burt Goodwin's office on the Pentagon's 4th floor. Now, Burt, he was a civilian attorney responsible for protecting the Air Force's legal interests in the Condon Report. I remember it was just after 3 p.m. as I wheeled into Goodwin's office. And, no one in the Air Force had seen the report, believe it or not, and as yet. Now, Burt and I had one hour to review the report because we were to make it available to the Pentagon Press Corps at 4 p.m. that day, embargoed for simultaneous release in Washington and Boulder, Colorado, at noon Eastern Standard Time the next day. As I said, believe it or not, Goodwin and I were actually the first Air Force officials to lay eyes on the report. The Air Force had been scrupulous, almost paranoid, about taking pains to avoid seeing the Condon Report until it was ready for public release. So as we quickly skimmed the report, it became obvious that Dr. Condon hadn't found evidence of any little green men. I agreed with Goodwin when he said, we couldn't have done a better job had we written it ourselves. Now, what Burt meant by that remark is obvious to anybody remotely familiar with the history of the Air Force and UFOs. With the prestigious Condon Report in our favor, we could finally see a graceful exit from what has been called the most monumental military foul-up since the Battle of the Bulge. Excuse me. So the story of the Air Force and UFOs is essentially a story of a credibility gap wider than the Grand Canyon. During its more than 20 years of investigating so-called flying saucers, the Air Force had been accused of every conceivable sin, and had been guilty of some. What are some of the charges? Well, that we were conspiring to conceal the truth about UFOs, which in the view of sensational authors of UFO books were really alien spaceships. That we officially concluded in 1948 that UFOs were really interplanetary spaceships. Now, there's some truth to that. There was a group of analysts at ATIC, the forerunner of the Foreign Technology Division, that did come up with a conclusion that said there must be spaceships. from outer space. As it made its way up the chain, it was never officially endorsed or agreed to by the Pentagon. It was shot down by the brass as not a theory worthy of support, no evidence to support that. The one I think is kind of interesting is that we were charged with harboring the remains of a half dozen or so humanoid corpses at a morgue at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. I want to tell you a story about that. Let's fast forward to the mid-'70s. I was assigned to Wright-Patterson at the Aeronautical Systems Division, which, among other things, had responsibility for the Foreign Technology Division, which, was the home of Project Blue Book. So there was a story that appeared that said we were harboring remains in Building 8 at Wright-Patterson. Well, we have about 5 Building 8s, Building 8A, 8B, et cetera, et cetera. Well, this TV crew insisted on coming down to go through those buildings. So we let them, and we, of course, escorted them. And, of course, they found nothing. But what does that mean, right? They found, so anyway, they wanted to do a stand-up closing out the report in front of the Foreign Technology Division at headquarters. So I dispatched my chief of media relations at the time, Wayne Corbett. Wayne, a great guy. Anyway, Wayne went up there, and he's in front of the Foreign Technology Division, right? And he's doing the stand-up, denying that we are harboring the remains of humanoid corpses, when all of a sudden, the front doors open, and out walk two dwarfs, little people. And the camera zooms in on them. And they were cleaning people, actually. But you could just see, my God. Wayne never forgave me for that, for sending him on that task. Okay, let me go back a bit to the origins of the Condon study. In 1965, the Air Force finally recognized that UFOs were more of a public relations problem than they were an intelligence matter. On September 28th, then Director of Information, they called it Information at the time, it's now Public Affairs. The Director of Information, Major General Ben LaBailey, Ben is a great guy, he wrote to the Military Director of the Air Force Scientific Advisory Board asking for a review of Project Blue Book. Now, established in 1952, Blue Book, it documented somewhat over 12,000 cases and listed only 697, or about 5%, as unidentified in its 20-plus years. Now, I may have the only existent copy of Blue Book left. I spilled coffee over it one time. I don't know. I looked online. This was the final report of Blue Book that was issued in 1968. Here it is. Carl Sagan, there's an article in there too, by the way. Anyway, an ad hoc group of 5 distinguished scientists was set up, chaired by Dr. Brian O'Brien, believe it or not. He received his PhD from Yale University. Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer from Cornell, was a panel member. The committee met on February 3rd, 1966 in the Pentagon and released its report in March. Now, unlike other reports, this one was unclassified and was meant to be released to the public and the press. And this was no doubt a result of General LaBailey being in charge of requesting this. While fairly complimentary of Project Blue Book, the O'Brien Committee believed there was a need for more scientific investigation of UFOs in more detail and depth. And that recommendation ultimately led to the Air Force contract with the University of Colorado. Now, getting Dr. Condon to sign on wasn't easy. He was busy updating his book on the theory of atomic spectra, which, although written in 1935, was still the standard on the subject. And he was involved in a host of other activities. He was running for a seat on the Board of Regents and one thing or another. So the way we got him was Dr. Tom Ratchford of the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, AFOSR. He hit him where Condon was vulnerable, his patriotism and his vanity. And it helped that Dr. Will Kellogg of the National Center for Atmospheric Research out there in Boulder, he helped Ratchford lure Condon. Kellogg told Condon, if you do it, people will believe it. So, recalling the meeting later, Condon told me that flattery got him somewhere. So a meeting was held by between Colorado University and AFOSR officials on August 10th, 1966. That meeting lasted all day and was fruitful in that there was sufficient faculty interest in the project for subsequent negotiations. On August 31st, AFOSR formally asked Colorado to undertake the study, assuring that the scientists involved would have complete freedom. The university accepted only on the condition that the study would be conducted as a normal scientific research project and free from Air Force control and made public. We all agreed to that. So on October 7th, 1966, the news of the Colorado contract was announced by the Pentagon. Condon appointed Assistant Dean Robert Lowe of the Colorado University Graduate School as his project coordinator. Now, as many of you may know, it was a memo written by Lowe on August 9th, 1966 that turned up later in Look magazine and almost scuttled the entire project. The article Flying Saucer Fiasco by John Fuller hit the newsstands on May 14th, 1968. And by that time, I was assigned to the Pentagon. Lowe's memo read in part, quote, the trick would be, I think, to describe the project so that to the public, it would appear a totally objective study. But to the scientific community, it would present the image of a group of non-believers trying their best to be objective, but having an almost zero expectation of finding a saucer. Needless to say, Lowe was not thinking public relations when he wrote that memo. It caused a minor flap on the Pentagon's E-ring, complete with frantic calls between Condon and Secretary Harold Brown, Secretary of the Air Force, Harold Brown. The result was a statement by Lowe that in essence said there was no plot to produce a negative study result. My concern, he wrote, was the University of Colorado and its standing in the university world, attitudes that the scientific community would have toward the university if it undertook the study. Meanwhile, I prepared a statement attributed to Secretary Brown to the effect that although the Air Force had not as yet seen the Condon Report, we had no reason to believe that Dr. Condon and the university would not live up to the requirements of the contract. That's about all we could say. Now, Condon went on to grant several press interviews, then wisely cut them off. Once in Corning, New York, he gave a speech that kidded the subject. He told me later, well, that's as bad as if the Supreme Court judge would have kidded cases before him. It's just not done. I should not have done it. His remarks were subsequently reported in the Elmira, New York newspaper and, caused a lot of anxiety on the part of the Air Force. Now, we were cautious not to advise Dr. Condon on the public affairs aspects because we adopted this hands-off approach. But we were happy to learn that he would no longer discuss his study while it was still underway. Now, otherwise would put us in the embarrassing position to learn how his study was going through the newspapers. Now, Condon's investigative phase ended on June 1st, 1968, and the task of preparing the final report began. We set a meeting for September 30th at the university to discuss the many factors involved in making the Condon Report public. The Air Force team included staff officers from AFOSR and the Air Force General Counsel, and I represented the Secretary of the Air Force Office of Information. We met with Dr. Condon, T.E. Manning, who is Vice President for Academic Affairs, and Scott Tyler, who is the university's Public Affairs or Public Information Officer. Condon told us that his report was being edited by journalist Daniel S. Gilmore and would be ready by October 31st. He asked whether the report should be sent directly to the Air Force for transmittal to the National Academy of Sciences. I suggested it would be more prudent for Colorado to deliver just enough copies directly to the NAS and hold the remainder under lock and key until the NAS review was complete. Condon agreed. Manning informed us that the university had accepted in principle an offer from Bantam Books to publish the report in a paperback version. Now, this was news to us. He mentioned that Bantam was arranging for Walter Sullivan, science editor of the New York Times, to write the introduction. Now, I questioned whether Bantam and Sullivan were to get advanced copies of the report. And Manning assured us that they would not receive their copies until the report had been delivered to the Air Force. Apparently, Bantam was set to churn out copies within 80 hours after receiving the report. Now, although somewhat unorthodox, the idea of Bantam publishing a paperback appealed to us. We wanted to be sure the report received wide distribution at a reasonable cost. We later learned that the government printing office, now called the government publishing office, its version would take months to reprint. Surprise? At a cost of $5 a copy versus $1.95 for the Bantam version. The legal people determined that it was not an Air Force product per se, it was a University of Colorado product, so they could do what they wanted to as far as publishing the report. And that was fine by us. The University of Colorado turned over its final report to the National Academy of Sciences on November 15th, 1968. Meanwhile, we waited anxiously. Our contract with Colorado called for only 225 copies of the report, a woefully inadequate number, in my opinion. Unfortunately, we in public affairs were not consulted when that contract was drawn up. We were faced with several problems. How should we determine press distribution? Should the Air Force hold a press conference without Dr. Condon, who declined to hold one himself? These questions raised others. How soon should we release the report once we received it? How should we release it? By early December, DOD was pressing us for our plans on how the report should be released. I met with Major General William Garland, who was the Air Force Director of Information, to discuss options. In brief, 50 copies were to be set aside for the press, 3 read-only copies in our office, 3 copies in our New York, Chicago, and Los Angeles field offices, a copy each in the University of Colorado, and at Project Blue Book at Wright-Patterson. 42 copies were for the Pentagon Press Corps. Excuse me. Shortly after New Year's Day, 1969, Dr. Condon called the Air Force Secretary Brown to voice concern over the amount of time, in his opinion, the National Academy of Sciences was taking to review his report. So Brown called Frederick Seitz, NAS president, and learned that the panel, chaired by Yale University's Gerald M. Clements, was finalizing its work. We could expect the NAS review on January 8th, 1969. As I said at the outset of my remarks, we were a happy group of campers on January 8th. Not only did Condon come to the same basic conclusions about UFOs as did the Air Force, but the NAS gave the Condon Report straight A's. A major point of Condon's report that jumped out at us was this statement: the continuance of Project Blue Book is of dubious value. The NAS review stated, among other findings, that on the basis of present-day knowledge, the least likely explanation of UFOs is the hypothesis of extraterrestrial visitations by intelligent beings. Now, press reaction to the Condon Report was, for the most part, what we had hoped for. For example, the now defunct Washington News, which reported the Washington National Airport incident in near hysterical terms in 1952, editorialized in its January 18th, 1969 edition, quote, dedicated disciples of the Little Green Men from Mars School no doubt will find the Condon Report represents another diabolical plot to suppress the truth. But most Americans will find the report something less than a surprise. Apart from wasting time, continuing study would waste taxpayer money. Now, the Pentagon bureaucracy, surprise, surprise, grinds on at a snail's pace. It was in early March 1969 that a meeting was held in the Pentagon to discuss the future of Project Blue Book. From the moment the meeting opened, there was no doubt in our military minds that Blue Book was finished. There was considerable debate, however, on such details as obtaining the approvals of the Chief of Staff of the Air Force and the Secretary of the Air Force, and where to store the records of Project Blue Book. And we were also concerned with what should we tell people when they observe a UFO. If the Air Force was no longer interested, who was? The question of a new home for Project Blue Book's records was more complex than it would seem. The key was finding a location that was accessible, yet not too inviting. Among others considered were the Federal Records Repository near Washington, the National Archives, which, by the way, is now where they reside, the Smithsonian, and I recommended that the Air Force Museum at Wright-Patterson because Foreign Technology Division, where the records were, was on Wright-Patterson, just move them over to the museum. Well, that was vetoed by my boss, Bill Coleman, Colonel Bill Coleman at the time, who, by the way, I was telling Scott this on the way up here, that Bill retired and became technical advisor to that first series called Project UFO. I don't know if you remember that in the 70s. You remember that? Okay. Bill went over to the dark side too, but anyway. But his idea was well-founded. The Air Force Archives in Maxwell Air Force Base, Alabama, required a background check before anyone could go in there because the files were stored in a classified area. Now, I had a difficult time persuading the Air Force Archives, the Maxwell folks, to accept the Blue Book records. They were not thrilled. It's going to increase our workload, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So I took a call from my general to their general for that to happen. You know how that works. So they did take on the records, and they stayed there for a number of years before they were transferred to the National Archives. That's where they are now, right? We then went on to develop guidance to base commanders and information officers, public affairs officers, as to what to tell people who see a UFO and call to the base to report it. We advised commanders that they should they receive such a report, they should conduct at their discretion a minimum investigation, local investigation. If unable to identify the source of the sighting, they should refer the caller to the local police. The cops loved us. It took almost the entire year of 1969 before we were ready to approach the Air Force Chief of Staff and the Secretary of the Air Force for approval to terminate Project Blue Book. On December 16th of 69, after the Chief, General John D. Ryan, concurred, Brigadier General Harry Hogan, who succeeded General Garland as Air Force Director of Information in July of 69, he briefed Air Force Secretary Robert C. Seamans. Seamans had replaced Brown in February 1969. The next day, December 17th, 1969, which was the 66th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight, by the way, it just happened to be that way. In a press release I wrote, we announced to the world that Project Blue Book was no more. By way of closing, I want to tell you in brief about an interview I did with Dr. Condon on February 15th of 1972. Courtesy of the Air Force, I was attending the University of Denver in pursuit of my master's degree in mass communications. I chose as the topic for my thesis the UFO phenomenon, the study in public relations. When I called Dr. Condon to ask for an interview, he remembered me. He was really not interested in talking about the subject. I cajoled and, said, that's for my thesis, and, would you play pretty please? All right, come on out. Yeah. So my wife and I went out to see Dr. Condon, and I had my tape recorder and transcribed, and that's part of my thesis, is that interview. He was quite candid in his comments, and I've cleaned up some of his comments in the brief remarks I will read to you. He called the authors of sensational UFO books, quote, a bunch of frauds. They started writing exaggerated science fiction sorts of things. Speaking of Dr. Hynek, who was, as Scott mentioned, a UFO consultant to the Air Force, and is to be the lead character in the History Channel's Project Blue Book TV series, right? Yeah, this coming winter. Condon said, you should have fired Hynek very early in the game. And he had a few other choice words, which I don't want to use. But anyway, Hynek, by the way, was something of an enigma to the Air Force. He was hired in '48 as a consultant, but as time went by, he was used less and less. He was involved in the famous swamp gas incident in Michigan. You might remember that. Anyway, the Air Force claimed that he really became a confirmed believer in the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So the Air Force let his contract quietly expire some months before the termination of Project Blue Book, which was December '69. Now, I had been sure that Hynek's dismissal would be picked up by the press as an indication of the Air Force's intention. Surprisingly, it was not. Condon called the time doing the study 2 years of tremendous strain and wasted time. It almost ruined his reputation, he told me. I asked him if he knew then what he knows now, would he have taken on the project? He said, certainly not. I wish I hadn't. It was just a moment of aberration. And finally, he said, he closed the interview with an anecdote. Someone said to him, Doc, what would happen now if you'd really see a flying saucer? He replied with a chuckle, I'd get out a revised edition of the study. That's it. That's all I have. Thanks very much, but I'd be happy to take any of your questions, please. Yes, sir.
You said toward the end that the Air Force wanted to get rid of Hynek
Yes.
because he started to believe that UFOs were real.
Yes.
Well, isn't the idea behind a study that you're supposed to have people with open minds?
Yes. Yes, and Hynek felt that the Air Force closed its mind, and there may be some truth to that, but I would say that in Condon's case, he approached it with an open mind, and I asked him that question. He said, we had to have an open mind, not be negative toward the study. But in all the cases we revealed, the key word, and I used this in that WTOP interview that many of you have seen, there was no compelling evidence of the origin, but he always hedged. He said, present day knowledge, leave that door open. Who knows? Something in the future might reveal visitations, but based on what he reviewed, no. Now, he did say they kept an open mind on it. There are those who feel that maybe were not the case. He had different investigators on the project, and you see the Lowe memo. You could interpret that memo as saying, well, gee, they already made up their mind. And even Condon, during the study, kidded the subject, and he shouldn't have done that. But I think he quickly came to the conclusion that he's not going to be able to determine the origin of UFO reports, although he did find some puzzling. He did find some. There was a case in Bentwaters, England, that was particularly troublesome as far as coming up with a probable cause. And it really is listed as one of those unidentified cases.
Would you describe one that you find particularly interesting of the ones that you've looked at?
The cases?
Yeah, that you found particularly intriguing, particularly interesting.
Yeah. I was not an investigator, so I can't say that I examined all the cases, but this Bentwaters thing was interesting. It was in England, Air Force base, RAF Bentwaters, the Air Force had that. And there were lights, and, there were airmen, and a colonel went out there to look, and they just were astonished by what they thought they saw, just bright lights that would come and disappear. Now, I've seen explanations that what they saw was a lighthouse going around and that sort of thing. They just were not able to get to the bottom of that case. And it's a very puzzling case. So that's one, I think, that remains puzzling, to say the least. Now, Roswell, anybody going to ask about Roswell? Roswell, when I wrote this thesis, I covered some of the major cases. This was 72 when I wrote the study. Roswell occurred in 47 and wasn't even on my scope. It didn't gain notoriety until sensational books about UFOs were written in the 70s. And, there was an article that appeared in a local paper there that we captured the crash saucer, and we had the remains in a morgue, etc. That story was eventually retracted. The Air Force did issue a denial. In any event, authors came across that story later on in the 70s, and wrote these stories, and it just caught on. And Roswell, of course, became a mecca for UFO enthusiasts. Now, what happened? I think it was conclusively proved that what happened was in a secret project, there was testing of high altitude weather balloons under a project called Project Mogul, and these were a train of 16 balloons monitoring Soviet radio waves. And of course it was secret for a long time. And one crashed. And they recovered, they didn't recover any remains, but they recovered the the crash remains of those train of balloons, and that led to the charges of spacecraft, so forth. So, but I think Roswell is more hype than anything. Yeah. In the back, yes, sir. No, you, okay.
I think when they talked about the aliens that the government is hiding, didn't that originate? I think his name was Frank Scully.
Yeah, there was Scully did write a book to that effect.
Yeah, and he had Wright-Patterson Air Force Base, but later on, the action seemed to change to Area
51, yeah, I know. Yeah, I never really covered 51 in my thesis either. That wasn't on the scope. Area 51 was the Nellis Air Force Base out there. Tested a lot of secret aircraft at the time. But at Wright-Patterson, we did have a lot of sophisticated aero propulsion lab stuff. We actually had a cryogenic cooler that the reporter swore we had them on ice. They couldn't find them. We were always moving it, But that was the problem and the frustrating part, and why the Air Force, I guess, didn't engage in the debate, because you can't prove a negative. I can't prove to you that something doesn't exist. It may, but I can't prove it. But you have to prove to me that it does exist. What is its origin? What is your proof? Some proof. And Phil Klass had that standing offer. Many of you know that. In '66, he had this offer of $10,000, which was, money at the time. Three conditions. Any one of three conditions, he would give $10,000. That was one, if the National Academy of Sciences examined some material that they concluded was from outer space, a spaceship. Or if somebody presented that kind of material and they determined it was unearthly in origin. Or finally, if an alien being presented itself before the General Assembly of the United Nations or appeared on national television. That never happened, so he never had to give up his $10,000. No.
Can I ask a question?
Sure.
When the Washington Blitz happened,
Yeah.
what was the general consensus of the government at the time, between the actual politicians, between the military, between the Air Force? Because you had so many people seeing things.
Yeah. Well, mostly it was on radar and stuff that they saw,
They saw radar, and people actually saw things, but
Yeah.
so now you've got two different phenomenologies.
Yeah.
But still, the conclusion was it was, some phenomenon.
I think it was temperature inversion,
Yes.
temperature inversion, something like that. Condon took a look at that too. Because it was in the backyard there of Washington, it caused quite a commotion. And the Air Force had probably its first and only press conference on that subject, trying to come to a conclusion of it in temperature inversion. What always puzzled me, they sent up jets from Dover Air Force Base. Why the hell Dover? Andrews is there. What were they doing? I don't know. I don't know the answer to that question. As to why they didn't get up there and intercept whatever they see. But reports of pilots seeing strange lights and dashing away, nothing new. I mean, it goes back to Foo Fighters in World War II. But the most recent report was in 2004, these Navy pilots spotted something. They were vectored to try to see what they were, and the things chased away. And they were not able to determine what they were. And that, I think, was the catalyst for Senator Harry Reid to establish within DOD this new group that was looking at investigating UFOs at the time. In 2004, I guess, to 2012, when they finally stopped that and decided that they had better ways to spend their money. And they didn't come up with anything either, although there are some allegations that there's still a study going on. You know, who knows about that? But I don't know. Did I answer your question? Or
It's fine. I was just kind of thinking, you know, between the president and the council, and with all these people that saw everything,
Yeah.
you know, you can only have but so much, you know, temperature inversions and swamp gas. Or
Yeah.
whatever. You know,
Yeah.
I'm thinking that it happening right here, there would have been people that would have said, okay, something's not quite right. We actually saw this with our own eyes. It didn't seem to be the temperature thing. Someone needs to give us an answer now as to what it is. Because it seemed kind of funny that when, I forget the Air Force general that said, you know.
Samford?
Yeah, when he was saying that this is, you know, not a national security issue, it was, you know, something else.
There hasn't been overt action by any of these lights or whatever it is they see. I mean, they didn't fire on us. They didn't try to, you know, maybe they were observing us. We don't know. So the Air Force's job was national security, of course, and they just felt that anytime they chase something, it goes away, and they haven't any reason to believe there was a threat to national security. And no advanced scientific knowledge, which was, you know, early on the concern of intelligence in the 47 after Kenneth Arnold was the first one to spot these disc-like objects at Mount Rainier, and that's when kind of the stories broke about flying saucers. And we didn't know what they were, and maybe the Russians, maybe the China, who knows, you know. But they not quickly, but within a couple of years, came to the conclusion that no hostile threat, no advanced scientific knowledge, and no evidence about it coming from outer space.
The comment to what you were saying, a lot of times when you actually look at these in detail, the number of people that actually experienced the event is actually much smaller than the number who said they experienced it. So when you look at them who actually saw some lights, it's very small compared to the number that claim they have seen it.
Agreed. Yeah, and Phil had I think in one of his books he says the rule of ufology. If somebody sees something on radar, somebody will see some strange lights, maybe in the opposite direction, but then, because people are not that familiar anymore with the night sky, and or what lights may appear in a particular location. You know, make something strange may be going on. I remember in one of his cases, he reported these lights that seemed to move back and forth. It was an air tanker that was orbiting, you know, as part of a mission where they were, you know, to refuel an aircraft in some sort of training mission. You know,
well, one of the most recent cases was called the Phoenix lights, right? Are you familiar with that one? And these lights appeared in 2 different times, and you know, the explanation was they were A-10s on a bombing run or practice run or something, they, coming from another base, Davis-Monthan, I think, in Arizona. But
So I have something to say about that. I was there at that time,
really,
and I saw what I saw, but I still don't have an answer.
yeah.
So-
Well, that's you know, that's a lot of these explanations are their best estimate explanation. You know, the data isn't there. That's the problem. The data isn't there. Yes.
So it seems like this University of Colorado study, one of the primary reasons they were contracted by the Air Force was for public relations reasons. And yet when the contract was made, public relations were not consulted about how many copies you were to get or all of that. Did that in any way change policies moving forward?
I would hope so.
Yeah. Or change anything, or did you get to have any kind of say afterwards about what you would like to have happened in the future?
Oh yeah, we raised hell about the number of copies, but you know, it was too late by that time because that's what the contract called for. But you know, the saving grace, if you want to call it that, was that the Bantam edition would be out lickety-split. And we knew it would be unabridged, and we were assured it would be unabridged, and it would contain the relevant information. So that eased our concern to a certain extent. But I was concerned from the media standpoint, how are we going to serve this, voracious appetite of the press for these reports? And as I said, a good friend of mine, he's down in Williamsburg, Marv Brayman. Marv was at in DOD, they had a service representative, Air Force, Army, Navy, Public Affairs. I was upstairs in the Air Force. Marv was an Air Force officer, so he was my point of contact in DOD. And he was pressing me for the plans on release. And he said, "What are you doing, Dave?" And I said, "Well, Marv, we only have 225 copies, and here's what we're kind of thinking." He says, "That's absurd. I can't tell Dan Partner of the Denver Post to go out to the University of Colorado to read the report or what have you. He has every right, and more so, because work was basically done in his backyard. Then 42 guys in the Pentagon that I couldn't argue with that, but my hands were tied. So we did learn. I think we did learn that lesson. I can't think of another project, like that we would have weighed in on. And why we weren't consulted? Well, contracts go on all the time, but and Air Force. There's usually a public release statement in the contracts as to how, but it'll be reviewed by the Air Force, but not the number of copies. And you would think a subject of this magnitude would have come to the attention of the Pentagon. I was not there at the time, not that I would have. I think I would. I hopefully would have said, "Hey, we need more than 225 copies. Let's take a collection and pay for it." But so anyway.
Just wanted to say, if you do want to see the Condon Report, you'll get your data. It's about 450 or 500 pages.
Yeah, it's a lot of data.
There's lots of pictures and data, like 10,000 cases. So there's a lot there, and it's available. Just go ahead and have to look for it.
If you had the chance to do this all again, do you think you would do anything different?
In terms of public relations, or just in terms of the study?
Well, in public relations on this particular subject.
Oh, yeah. You could read my thesis. There's only one copy. We should have been more forthcoming. Now, there are a lot of people who are not going to believe the government, and maybe with good reason. Not narrowing it down to this case, but this subject. And so when you get into a situation of saying, "Believe me," they may not believe you. You gotta work up trust. You gotta be candid. You gotta be believable, and just hope that you can sway public opinion. When I say sway, I mean, see our point of view, And the Air Force wasn't really able to do that. And as I said, intelligence handled it in the beginning. And they won't talk to anybody, intelligence, Yes, sir.
There's been a lot of, back when a lot of these initial reports were done, there was very little objective evidence. A lot of it was eyewitness reports, people not necessarily knowing which direction, but, we still get reports about, Venus, being a UFO and stuff like that. Now there's been a lot more, there's people going around with cameras almost all the time. Yeah. And I'm not sure that the number of UFO reports has been significant, but there's all kinds of new optical phenomena that we now know about because people, they're flying along in the plane and they look out and they see the sun reflecting off a layer of ice crystals from the plane window. And then when the plane banks, it goes, flying because the angle changes so fast, and it has a lot of characteristics of these UFO reports and the possibility that these could be re-examined with perspectives of some of the new knowledge would be really interesting as a scientific exercise in terms of how to analyze historical data.
Yeah, the question was asked earlier about who should look at this. Well, maybe if there's sufficient evidence, it should be presented, say, to the National Academy of Sciences, to AAR, what is it, Advanced?
National Science.
Yeah, right. An organization like that to take a look at the scientific aspects of it. In the back.
You mentioned an introduction to the Bantam edition.
Yeah.
I'm curious if you recall what its nature was and also whether there were any concerns you had that it might skew the public perception of the report.
Well, we were careful not to know what, not to know not only what was in the report, but what Walter Sullivan was going to write, the New York Times guy who wrote the introduction. So, yeah, we had a lot of angst, because we didn't, I guess it's fair to say, we didn't expect any explosive news, out of it. But we didn't know exactly how Condon would come down on the overall subject. So that was our angst. The same thing with Sullivan in the New York Times. What would he say? But we really adopted a hands-off approach. We didn't want to be accused of manipulating the study, manipulating the report, whitewashing, whatever that we've been charged with. So that's why we adopted the hands-off approach, and that's why, we really didn't know what the report said until Burt Goodwin and I reviewed it on January 8th.
Of all the ones that you saw, what percentage roughly do you think are actually hoaxes? Are people deliberately trying to?
Oh, there may be. There may be
a stat in there. Okay.
There may be a stat on that.
Reference guy.
I may have to.
I'm just curious, what percentage are people just misidentifying things and which are deliberate hoaxes?
Yeah, there is a category for that. Let me see if they've got that. They have it broken out. Total cases by category. And they got, astronomical, aircraft, balloon, insufficient data, satellite, so forth. Astronomical sightings, meteors, stars, and planets. Other cases, hoaxes, hallucinations, unreliable reports, psychological causes, etc. Okay. In 1957, there were 37. It goes on like that. In total of 241 were attributed to that.
Out of several thousand reports total?
Yeah, out of the 12,000. Out of the 12,000 reports.
Okay, so we're talking only like
small
percentage.
Yeah.
Now if they have in a Photoshop, I wonder if we're going to see more of that.
Yeah.
Dave, I wanted to ask you about this headline for WTOP's interview.
Yeah, what does it say? They used a
says,
couple of headlines.
Former Pentagon official.
Yeah, I am.
Calls for big UFO reveal after secret investigation.
Yeah, I looked at that thing and I said, what the hell,
The article is reflective of your views.
the article, that's right.
This is classic clickbait.
Yeah, that's right.
You survived.
I think I did. I don't know. But I got to leave here first.
That's right. As I said, it was possible you were being followed by men in black. And I had to take evasive maneuvers. That's my cover story. Listen, I guess if there are any more questions.
Well, we can gather afterwards if you want to do
right.
that.
And we're getting refreshments here. Let's thank our speakers.